Hello. In this video, I'm going to do a research design breakdown where we look at the Chapter 2 review exercises numbered 7, 10, and 11. And these all have in common that they are research studies, and we're going to break them down on some of the critical factors that we've been discussing recently. So first, let's look at number 7. According to a study done at Kaiser Permanente in Walnut Creek, California, which is a big insurance company, users of oral contraceptives have a higher rate of cervical cancer than non-users, even after adjusting for age, education, and marital status. Investigators concluded that the pill causes cervical cancer. Okay, so we're just going to use this information that's given to us in the prompt to evaluate these 4 items. Part A, is this a controlled experiment or an observational study? Well, just based on the information that's given, and that's all we're going to go off of. It's a key thing to remember. Don't read into a question things that aren't there. We're given some reported data, and it sounds like this is an observational study. Why is this an observational study? Because Kaiser Permanente couldn't randomly assign participants to take oral contraceptives or not take oral contraceptives. The women in the study either took oral contraceptives or they didn't, and they reported that back to Kaiser Permanente. So next up, why did the investigators adjust for age, education, and marital status? Well, these are likely confounders. Just as we looked at age as a confounder, education is often seen a confounder. Um, Education could be associated with use of oral contraceptives, in that women with higher education are more likely to use oral contraceptives and to use them correctly. Marital status as well. Women of different marital statuses have different patterns of sexual activity, if that makes sense. And so they're therefore exposed to a different kind of risk, especially when compared to women who are using oral contraceptives but are not married. And age is purely again associated with health. As age increases, risk of a cervical cancer increases. And part C, women using the pill are likely to differ from non-users on another factor which affects the risk of cervical cancer. What factor is that? I know I cued it a little early here. That's sexual activity patterns. So women who are using the pill are more likely to have a different sexual activity patterns than women who are not using the pill. And a person's sexual activity patterns is associated with their risk of cervical cancer, because the primary cause of cervical cancer is exposure to HPV. So that's the scientific answer here. But if you thought of something else, like maybe they differed on another factor like socioeconomic status, whereas women who are using the pill were more likely to have a higher socioeconomic status than non-users, because they were more likely to have insurance and have access to the pill. Although I guess all the women on this study, well, since this is a study by Kaiser, an insurance company, we maybe could assume that everyone had access to insurance, but we don't really know. They haven't told us whether or not this is just people enrolled in Kaiser or a larger group. So the point here is that if you came up with another factor for C, that's fine. The issue is with your reasoning for why you think that factor would explain the difference between users and non-users, and in a way that affects the risk of cervical cancer. Finally, part D, Were the conclusions of the study justified by the data? Answer yes or no and explain briefly. Always, when you have a question like this, go back and remind yourself, well, what were the conclusions of the study? So go back into the prompt. Investigators concluded that the pill causes cervical cancer. Well, that is a big conclusion to make, and it's one that is too big for the scope of this study. If I wanted to conclude that the pill causes cervical cancer, you want to have some real data there and that is experimental, ideally in a double blind experiment. We just don't have that kind of data here, and it seems that that would be a conclusion that's overreaching, and the a big reason why it would be so inappropriate to make here is that if we think back to item C, the it's sexual activity that is really associated with the increased risk of cervical cancer more than the pill. Use of the pill is just associated with sexual activity. Okay. So let's take a look at our next problem in the research design breakdown. In item 10, we have a study of young children found that those with more body fat tended to have more controlling mothers. The San Francisco Chronicle concluded that parents of fat kids should lighten up. Was this an observational study or a randomized controlled experiment? Well, let's break it down. Here we're told that, again, we can only go on what's given in the prompt. We're told that there's a study of young children, just found that those with more body fat tended to have more controlling mothers. That's all we know. But logic tells us that the investigators here couldn't have randomly assigned uh, children to particular mothers. That's impossible. So, of course, this study has to be observational. We can't randomly assign kids to specific mothers. So, this is an observational study. Part B, did the study find an association between mother's behavior and her child's level of body fat? Yes, they did find this association. That's what they've told us. They found that those with more body fat tended to have more controlling mothers. Uh, it's important to remember that association isn't causation, and this is an idea that we will definitely be revisiting uh, repeatedly in Unit 2 when we get to correlation and regression. Let's look at item C, which says, if controlling behavior by the mother causes children to eat more, would that explain an association between controlling behavior by the mother and her child's level of body fat? And indeed, that would, because now this is a hypothetical that we're told we know that controlling behavior by a mother causes children to eat more. So that would explain an association if that were true, but we don't know that that's true. Let's look at another supposition in D. Suppose there's a gene which causes obesity. Would that explain the association? Well, if there was a gene that causes obesity, then it would be the gene that's associated with obesity. So, no, that would not explain an association between the mother's behavior and her child's obesity. In item E, we're asked, can you think of another way to explain the association? And the simplest other way to explain this association is to remember, well, yes, I can think of another way to explain it. And that other way is that perhaps when a child has more body fat, the mother is more worried about her child's diet and gets more controlling about the weight, what her child eats, etc. A mother who sees her child eat too much might respond in a way that a psychologist would call controlling, like saying to the child, Johnny, stop eating, or Are you sure you want dessert? So, but this is again a reciprocal response to the child. So we don't know which direction this association goes. Finally, do the data support the Chronicle's advice on child rearing? No, it doesn't. Again, this is an example of overreaching. What was the Chronicle's advice on child rearing? You should remind yourself before making a decision here. The advice was parents of fat kids should lighten up. Well, that's pretty general advice too. So it seems like we don't really know what parents of fat kids should do based on this study. And so we see this a lot in news that sometimes study findings are taken out of context and then glorified or sensationalized to make it more appealing to 24-hour news cycle. And so we have one more problem or one more exercise left in the research design breakdown. Item 11. California is evaluating a new program to rehabilitate prisoners before their release. The object is to reduce the recidivism rate, the percentage who will be back in prison within 2 years of release. The program involves several months of boot camp, military-style basic training with very strict discipline. Admission to the program is voluntary. According to a prison spokesman, those who complete boot camp are less likely to return to prison than other inmates. Let's look at Part A. What is the treatment group in the prison spokesman's comparison, and what is the control group? Well, we have two groups here. And in the treatment group, they volunteered for and completed the program. Whereas in the control group, we have other prisoners, just all other inmates. Those could be non-volunteers or inmates who volunteered for the program but didn't complete it. So this control group is mixed. And just to preview ahead for the next item, we can see that this must be an observational study because inmates were not assigned by the investigators to the treatment or control groups. The inmates assigned themselves to these groups. They either volunteered for the program and completed it, or they didn't. The participant decided, so that makes this an observational study. And so finally, we have one piece left here, item C, true or false. The data show that the boot camp worked. Okay, well, what are the data that we're talking about here? And to figure out what those data are, we go back into our prompt and can see that the data that they're referring to is this observation that those who complete boot camp are less likely to return to prison than other inmates. Well, that statement is, since it is true, sure, those who completed boot camp were less likely to return to prison than other inmates, but we don't know, that doesn't mean that the boot camp worked, okay? Because this was an observational study, so item C is false. The data didn't show that the boot camp worked. It just showed that the participants who completed the boot camp are less likely to return to prison. But there could be other issues with those prisoners who completed the program, and there likely are other issues. So the participants who completed the program were more motivated. They might have been different than the other prisoners in that they were a different type of offender. Like, we don't know anything about what their other aspects of their personality, other things that contribute to recidivism. So there are definitely possible confounders here that we don't have enough information on. So we cannot say that the data show that the boot camp worked. That's false. Right? Thanks for watching. Remember to come back and watch more of our videos on statistics For the most efficient way, do some statistics every day.